Okay, I think we can slowly start. Good, welcome everyone to this deep dive on Europe and China in the Global South. We will discuss today ways of how the EU and China interact in the global zero carbon development, be it in form of cooperation, complementarity, or competition. My name is Sarah Rippert. I work here at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation on global cooperation and transformation issues. And I will be co-moderating this workshop together with Fabiola, who will introduce herself in a second. While we still wait for Olumide, who will join as our last speakers, let me already introduce a little bit the topic that we are about to discuss today. We already heard it in the morning. 10 years after the Paris Agreement, the global climate landscape has fundamentally shifted. The US has withdrawn from multilateral climate action, and we have basically two major economic powers left, the EU and China, that both have the strategic interest but also the capacity to shape decarbonization globally. And nowhere does this matter more than in countries of the global south, or as others have called it, the global majority. If it's indecisive whether we stay in safe climate boundaries if those countries either choose a fossil-based growth pathway or whether they leapfrog into clean technologies. And I think what's very important, and this is also something we heard in the morning that Adriana very much stressed, is that those countries are not passive bystanders. They are the arena, and they are also increasingly the actors in which the future of global climate action will be decided. So both the EU and China are very actively engaged already in shaping energy transitions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but they bring very different motivations, strategies, instruments, and also models of development. And also, of course, the relationship with each other is marked by, to at least a certain extent, by growing tensions, which is economic rivalry, strategic competition, but also diverging visions of order. So the question this workshop sets out to explore is, what does this mean for the global energy transition? Is the EU-China interaction in the global south a story of competition that slows things down, a story of complementarity that accidentally adds up, or can it be, under the right conditions, a genuine cooperation that actually accelerates zero carbon development? A new scoping study by Germanwatch, commissioned by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, takes a first systematic look at exactly this dynamic. And this afternoon, for the very first time, we will present the findings. The study was just released yesterday, so you will be the first to hear the findings, engage in the discussion, and I also encourage everyone to engage critically throughout the next 2 hours that we will have. With this said, I would pass over to Fabiola, who will talk a little bit more about the structure of the workshop.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this nice introduction. So welcome also from my side, everyone. My name is Fabiola Arriaga. I am part of SLE from the International Cooperation Program at Humboldt University. So before we start, let me briefly introduce you to all of you the format. For those who were here in the morning, you know how it works. For the new ones, I'll tell you this is like an open fishbowl discussion. So the basic idea is that we have this inner circle of chairs. So everyone who wishes to come here and speak, it's able to. Right now, we are having a few inputs that will kick us off, but then the speakers will leave this inner circle. So the idea is to really have an interactive session with all of us. So when we finish these inputs, We will open the discussion for all of us. The inner circle will be available for everyone who wishes to contribute. Just come here, take a seat, simply share your thoughts, comments, and questions. But when you are done, please leave the circle for the other participants for also joining them. Participation is flexible, and speakers may rejoin anytime they want as well. Another important information is that this session is live streamed. So for those who are joining online, you can also submit your questions in Mentimeter. You will find the link in the video description. So I will make sure that all the questions that the online audience have are also brought into this inner circle. So please me help to identify what are the questions that are more interested for you, so you can vote the questions up. We encourage everyone here to join this inner circle anytime you want. But let's start officially this session, and as a quick warm-up, we have 2 questions in Mentimeter to also check maybe a little bit the knowledge in this room. So you might see now the QR code in the screens for the Mentimeter. You can scan this QR in order to answer the questions. And the first question says, who currently has the greatest influence on energy transition in the global south? And for that, we have 5 different options: China, the European Union, the United States, multilateral development banks, or regional actors. So take a moment to decide, in your view, who is the greatest influence on energy transition in the global south. Okay, very interesting. Okay, so maybe just a few more seconds. Well, very interesting to see that so far this audience think that China has the greatest influence on energy transition in the global south, which links very nicely with the next question, who says, thank you for saying that. So we can move on to the next question, please. Thank you. So the second question says, who would you best describe the current relationship between the European Union and China in the global south? We have, again, 5 different options. Okay, that was fast, nice. So we have competition, complementary, cooperative, or maybe too early to tell. That's why we are here, no, maybe? Okay.
And maybe just to add, I think what's also interesting, there are 2 different options of competition, and one is harmful to recipient countries, but the other one is also that it could be beneficial by expanding the options. So maybe this is also something that we can discuss later in the discussion. Under what ways can competition also be productive?
Okay, so actually so far, maybe the major of the people here think that competition in a beneficial way for the countries, but also too early to tell. So we keep also this on mind. That will be very nice also to the link to the next step that we have so far. Thank you so much for your participation. So this nice outcome led us to a presentation that now we have with Martin. So Martin, let me quickly introduce you to the audience. Martin Voss is a policy advisor on climate diplomacy and cooperation for Asia-China at Germanwatch. His work focuses on climate policy, European Union-China relations, and international cooperation on global decarbonization. He is one of the authors of the study, and now he will present its key findings. Great to have you with us, Martin. So you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Thank you, Sarah. I snuck a little negotiation in there. I think I'll be allowed 15 minutes. Okay. Not more. Yeah, I want to start by extending a warm thank you to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, to Jörg and his team, to Sarah, to Christina. With your support and in collaboration, we were able to produce this paper, on which you can see the title page on the wall, and which serves as the basis of our deep dive here today. And I also want to not forget to thank Maya, my co-author, with whom it was a pleasure to work on this topic. Before the dive, some shallow background info, but also I don't want to double Sarah's intro too much. We started working on this late last year, and the hook was that we want to take stock of what happened 10 years after the Paris Agreement. Well, it's different now, but still we're talking about fundamental changes, and a lot of smart things have been said yesterday, today here at this forum, so I don't want to double that too much. For us, the central question was, how is the EU positioning itself between the two superpowers, the US, the superpower of fossil fuels, and China, the superpower of electrotechnology? And what does this mean for the EU's engagement with countries of the global south? Our paper is a scoping study, which means it's a discursive contribution based on desk research and interviews. And in this work, we discuss current patterns of engagement by the EU and China in and with third countries in the global south, and we want to assess the underlying motivations and derive concrete recommendations for EU policy. I hope you'll get the chance again to scan this QR code. I'll try to make sure that's the case. And there's also papers lying around with the QR code, and also the study itself is printed out somewhere around here. Three parallel developments shape the context of this paper. The US's withdrawal from international climate policy and its belligerent fossil overreach that we've witnessed over the past months. China's rise as a powerhouse in electrotechnology and infrastructure over the past years, and the global energy price shock triggered by the Iran war very recently. The EU is doubly dependent, in our view, on fossil gas as an energy source from the US on the one hand side, and on imports of electrotech, whose supply chains are dominated by China to a critical extent on the other side. At the same time, like Sarah mentioned, only the EU and China, in our view, is credibly committed, at least on a national leadership level. On a subnational level, you can talk more detail, dedicated to the Paris Agreement, its goals, and international climate cooperation at large. This creates both shared responsibility and room to maneuver and reproach. And this paper asks not whether the EU should engage with China, but how. And we distinguish between three modes: complementarity, cooperation, and competition. But I'll get onto those at a later stage again. So all three major powers, the EU, China, and the US, are investing heavily in net zero solutions domestically. You can see this on the chart on the left-hand side of this slide here. And there's a steep drop-off after the US. Which comes in at third in overall investments. This was in 2025. And the motivations are quite different. So the US under Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and it is actively rolling back the largest climate policy package that it had in its history, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. But as we've also heard yesterday and today, it's seeing huge investments on the state level, for example, in California and Texas, where solar and batteries are proving an unbeatable solution. Geopolitically, the US uses oil and gas as leverage to exert power and to safeguard a feeble hierarchy that it sees itself atop of. Then China, on the other hand, has modest climate targets that are not a primary objective and driver for the development we see there. Instead, economic growth, energy security, and geopolitical influence are driving the expansion in the electrotech sector. The 15th five-year plan that we saw come out in March is now continuing this in a coordinated manner with aggressive, in part, industrial policy in the wind, hydrogen, and heat pump sectors. And this follows the earlier focus on solar, batteries, and electric cars. At the same time, coal-fired power remains an important part of the energy mix in the Chinese power sector, but notably renewable energy account for the majority of the additional electricity demand and how it's met in recent times. And furthermore, emissions overall have been stagnant over the last 12 months and running in China. And then finally, the EU, it has a real climate ambition, which is of recently more and more inextricably linked to competitiveness and strategic autonomy. And this shift is exemplified by going from the European Green Deal to the Clean Industrial Deal. At the same time, the EU is leading the way globally when it comes to integrating renewables into electricity grids regionally. And at present, we're seeing that the energy crisis has given new impetus to a number of EU policies that are coming to the fore again, such as electrification as a target, as well as the phasing out of subsidies for fossil fuels and the reduction of grid costs. We are in a moment of electrotech revolution. So this means that renewable energy and electric mobility, for example, have passed positive tipping points. Solar PV with batteries is now the cheapest option for new electricity generation almost everywhere. And while the figures are impressive, and a lot of this has to do with developments in China, I think this is kind of reminiscing the Mentimeter results that we just saw on the board. This is shaping the background of our discussion here, but there's also a lot to be said about how this revolution is playing out, which is very lopsidedly. So until recently, at least, this has been true, and we are now in a very dynamic moment. These are numbers for 2024 on the left-hand side, yeah? But it's still stark, and we have to do something with that. The proliferation of renewables has been so uneven that China and the OECD countries together account for 80% of the increase in capacity, and the rest of the world only shares the remaining 20%. And this is even more surprising when we look at the African continent, where 20% of the world's population is at home, and 85% of households who have yet to have access to electricity are housed. And this entire continent is only accounting for 2% of global investment in green technologies in total. The potential in Africa, as we all know, is enormous. Renewable energy potential exceeds the continent's projected electricity until 2040 by a factor of 10. What about the reasons for this? There are many, but I want to point out one, which is finance. So the key factor that is holding many of the African nations back in developing a power sector that is clean and just is finance. There's a high debt burden and repaying of loans and interests coupled with limited budgetary scope, which has also recently been more constricted by a dependence on fossil fuel imports, is holding many countries back, not only developing a power sector, but also in economic development in general. And to just put this into very blunt words, the debt burdens have risen to double since 2021 with the COVID crisis and everything that ensued. So now we are in this dynamic moment that the Strait of Hormuz crisis has brought. And yesterday we had a spectacular keynote from Beating from Amber. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but the situation couldn't be more strikingly in favor of the renewable solution, right? This chart was also on the board yesterday. I wanted to show it again because it shows that solar plus batteries, this combination, is coming, the capital cost for it is coming down fast. And we're only a few years away from it being fully cost competitive with fossil alternatives, even when you don't factor in subsidies. But even here, we see unevenness. So capital costs are still higher in many poorer and less developed countries, which does change the calculus in reality, where a country factor decides on whether a loan is granted, at what cost, what conditions, and whether an investment is made or not. This is evident of the, well, let's say the middle panel here on the board, where on the left-hand side you can see there's a steep drop-off going from the least developed countries to the richer countries. The blue part accounts for the country factor in capital costs for renewables. So the question here is, what do we make of this supercharged opportunity? And let's talk about China for a second. So its role in net zero development is quite stark. First off, it's supplying the world with electrotechnology. Curiously, the major markets remain primary destinations. So you can see on the left-hand side, these graphs, the topmost, this is for aggregate clean tech exports. So all technologies over the last 7, 8 years. And Europe and Asia are the major markets to which these goods are shipped. And I mentioned Africa earlier. On this left-hand graph, it ranks on the same level as Oceania, very much at the bottom. And this is saying something, I think. On the right-hand side, we see what the Hormuz crisis has meant for solar PV exports to China. From China to Africa, where they have tripled from February this year, from 200 million worth of solar PV shipped to Africa to over 650 million, so tripled from 1 month to the next. And this is the bright green light on the right-hand panel. This shot up from 1 month to the next. And is also translating into a spike in the all technologies curve. That is the darker one just above. So this was possible due to available capacities in China that find their way through commerce to end users. And this was similar to the richer households and the story of theirs in Pakistan that bought solar PV in recent years. But this is a part only of the development of a power sector, right? So it's incomplete if you were to go about shipping solar PV to a destination to develop a clean power sector. If you want to decarbonize entire economies and not only create a prosumer class, and then we've not even touched on the topic of value added, on employment, on economic development. Speaking of value added, this is also quite striking, where we can see graphs of Chinese overseas investments in clean tech that shot up from 2021 to 2022 and have remained very high since compared to the previous decade. In fact, either of the taller columns all are higher in total sum than the previous decades, all annual figures combined. So this is a study called the Green Leap Outward. It's a nice play on words. It shows that a lot of investment is going overseas, but if you want to look for Africa, again, you'll have to look hard because it's the second column from the right. It's the pinkish little square. And the markets are still the same as in the markets that wholesale goods are shipped to. It's the richer ones. It's Asia, it's Europe, and the ones that can pay for it. So this development goes in parallel with another one, which is a downward trend. And this is coming to pass over the last few years, where Chinese overseas finance has undergone a change. I don't want to talk about this too much, but because I want to talk about official development assistance in a second. This is a seminal study from 8Data that came out last year, where they applied ODA criteria at the financial flows that came out of China and found that on average, only about 2% of all financial flows that left China were actually ODA equivalent. And something else that's quite striking and really ringing the same tune as we've heard over my input thus far, a lot of the finance goes to non-poor countries. So the USA, for example, right? It's investments, it's enabling investments, but not in the places where they are needed as well. So this brings me to talking about the EU. What does it have to offer in terms of development assistance? And in our paper, we identify 4 core strengths. It's financial resources, instruments, and the ability to mitigate risk. It's sector-specific expertise. It's diplomatic capital, but it's also regulatory power that one can wield when you can command access to a major market like the one of the EU. At the same time, we've heard a lot from experts, what we've also heard yesterday and today, that there's a structural weakness in the European offer, that coordination is hamstrung, that the Brussels institutions and the member states are slow in initiating and implementing projects, that the initiatives are confusing, and also the intentions are not very clear as a result. And there's a competitive disadvantage. So I want to close by pointing at the factor of finance, where we see it's lacking in many regards, and it's under threat of eroding at the moment, as we can see here from OECD figures that came out recently, where we see that while the EU is still providing a lot of the ODA provided, actually it's over half of the total, it's about to go down. And for the first time in almost 30 years, major donor countries, including Germany and France, have cut their ODA funding, and this is probably a reverberation of the US aid cut that's exacerbating this trend. At the same time, a lot of talk is happening about private finance and other solutions supplanting that of ODA and what it can achieve. But I think it's worth, maybe for this purpose of this discussion here, to talk about what finance can do and also fill in terms of a gap that is left by the Chinese offer. I'll come to a case study, and then maybe that's also a curious opportunity for us to discuss whether it's a good view of how we see the EU to complement the Chinese offer. So we talk about complementarity, cooperation, competition. Complementarity would be where parallel involvement of the Chinese and European actors is happening, but a host country is crucially an agent that orchestrates these relationships. And both sides, the EU and China, give key inputs. So you don't have to think hard to think of what the Chinese input might be. It's components, it's electrotech at really, really low prices. What is it that the EU can provide? Well, this is one of the case studies we look at where we want, that was right. Where we look at a program in remoter areas of the Philippines that aims to put solar PV on public houses. And the idea is that this is not a clear-cut business case because of volume, because of remote, because of access, because infrastructure is lacking. But it's still something that needs to happen. When we talk about granting access to electricity to an underserved populace, this population exists, and it's not only the 700 million that we talk of, it's also a huge group of people that has access to unstable grids and electricity supply. So what the EU can do here, in our view, is providing easily financial means to de-risk the capital expenditure. As we saw, it's still quite different between poorer countries and richer countries, and level the playing field to unlock these small-scale investments that can also snowball into bigger ones. And to make this more palatable, maybe, for European decision makers, there's a lot that can be had from doing this. For example, by providing a key input, one could ask for and make mandatory that quality, labor, and circularity standards are heeded and applied to Chinese inputs. One could talk about the problem of cybersecurity risk that comes with using Chinese clean tech, and crucially, something that is, for example, also because we're talking about an Asian country here, likely in demand in Brussels, or something that they would like to see, is actual presence. We see a lot of Chinese flags and a lot of plaques where one can see that China is doing to help the development of countries and of constituencies. But the EU is quite absent in these areas of the world. And by providing this key input, I think a lot can be won, not only for the EU, but everyone involved. And I'll stop here. I'm sorry for being actually quite over time, even on the 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your insightful presentation. So we are keeping our questions and comments that your input brought us. And now it's time to present here our lovely discussants here. So I will start with you, Jennifer. Jennifer Morgan is the former Special Envoy for International Climate Action at Germany's Federal Foreign Office. She previously led Greenpeace International and has spent decades working on climate policy and international negotiations. Her background combines advocacy, diplomacy, and high-level climate governance. Thank you so much for being here. We have also with us Olumide Abimbola. He's the founder and executive director of the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI. His work centers on trade policy, regional integration, and Africa's role in economic and climate transformation. He brings strong expertise in research and policy advice across African and international contexts. Thank you so much as well. And we also have Xin-Fu Berthaud. She is the Director for Energy Diplomacy at the European Climate Foundation. She has broad experience working on climate, development, and energy issues with a strong international background. Her expertise includes energy diplomacy, renewable transitions, and cross-border climate cooperation. Again, thank you so much for all of you for being here.
So let's dive into the discussion. I would like to start with you, Jennifer. So you got the chance to already take a look at the study beforehand. So maybe you can share a little bit your thoughts on the outcomes. And then secondly, I would also be curious to hear a little bit more on the way China and the EU could collaborate, because in the morning you mentioned you actually see that there's also a need for cooperation. And since we didn't dive too much into the policy recommendations, maybe one question to you would be, what would be a policy recommendation that you would have for the EU, how to do this in a good and well manner? You have 5 minutes.
Okay. So I think congratulations on the study. I think I found it very useful to have the framing of the different roles. I thought that was quite good, and the competition, complementarity, and cooperation, because I think they're each very active right now. And I really like the case studies, because I really think we have to get down into what's actually being created on the ground in terms of investment, in terms of opportunities, and the different roles that the EU and China played in those case studies. And then maybe, I mean, you've kind of gone this way, and then you can go back up and say, okay, where are there opportunities right now where we are seeing investment is not occurring, where in a complementary way the two could work together. I think, so I would encourage to continue, I guess, in that sense. And to use the case studies as ways of telling the stories and digesting kind of what's worked, what hasn't worked. Where does a Europe need to build? Where does a China need to build? In the point of collaboration, so I am of the view, as I mentioned this morning, I was in Beijing last week, and tensions are high. And they're sensitive. So I was in a room where all of a sudden it was an official conference between the EU and China, and there was a workshop on trade, and so I've been thinking about so I think there's 4, and I understand it from both perspectives, and I think that's really important. Each has legitimate concerns, each has misunderstandings of different things. So I think from a European perspective, which I can speak about more than from a Chinese perspective, I think that Europe, as I said, I think there is no European strategy on China. You said it, Ole. That was my experience 15 years ago. I'd be in Beijing and there would be 4 different member states and the Commission offering different energy partnerships on the same day. And of course, China goes, oh, I like this one, and I'll take this one. And of course, they're smart. So I think getting an EU-China strategy is important. I think it has to cover all of these different areas around market. This wasn't necessarily the study, but I think we have to have an engagement on market access and deal with all of these concerns, from European perspective. So Europe needs to identify what are the critical economic sectors that you need to have produced in the European Union. Jürgen Trittin last night talked about local content requirements, talked about joint ventures, he talked about, and so I think that is the Industrial Accelerator Act, which the Commission has proposed. There's no German position on this, by the way. There's no debate in Berlin about this. So I think that's one. Where does Europe want to make sure? I mean, China has been doing that and will continue that. Number two, where does the EU want to compete? Where does it think that it can really compete? Number three, where is there strategic interdependence so that you want to have Chinese investment coming into Europe with joint ventures, with FDI, but with serious criteria? The BYD plant in Hungary is a really interesting case study on that. And where can you have the targeted cooperation? So around climate, energy security, et cetera. And there maybe I'll close talking about the third party, the third country piece. Because for a long time, also when I was in government, there was kind of this question, how can the EU and China do a project together in Africa? I've asked this question, right? And I didn't get very far, right? The intent is there. The Chinese are very interested in this. But just, one person said to me in Beijing, just the bureaucratic hurdles alone. Think about which ministries would need to be involved in just in Germany, right? To get that decision made and the politics of it. And then in China, who's leading? Is it BRI? Is it NDRC? Who is it? And by the time you figure that out, you may not get very far. So I think the complementarity piece, I think there can be more closer cooperation, but I think it's less like negotiating between the two, rather identifying investment opportunities where, from a European perspective, there is visibility. Because the thing about the examples that often come up is that it's Chinese technology. So everybody thinks it's Chinese, it's a China investment, when actually there may have been European investment, but there's nothing to see. So I think getting European visibility on that and opportunities also for German and European companies on that. But let's use COP32 as a moment. I mean, look at where we're going. We're going to Ethiopia. They have a ban on the internal combustion engine imports. They want to go big on renewables. Kenya is right close by. So what about identifying some big investments? Bring in the criteria. The standards is an area I think there's real interest and real need from everybody's perspective to negotiate common standards on certain things. And then work in that manner with good what's the right word, brokers who can kind of bring the different interests together while you're working through the fundamental relationship to rebuild trust.
Thank you, Jennifer. I would directly go to you, Olumide, and maybe touching on this a little bit, what you said. I mean, one outcome of the study, I think, was also that there's actually a lot of action happening in terms of complementarity, where it's not necessarily planned from China or the EU, but it just happens because third countries coordinate because they have their own interests, and then they go exactly as you said earlier, Olumide, they do basically shopping, right? They have like their interests defined, and then they know China can deliver on this front, and then on the other front we will try to engage the EU. So my question would be a little bit, what role do the countries themselves have in shaping this agenda? But also, what role maybe have also other neutral conveners that you mentioned, which could, for example, also be the MDBs?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the study. I remember being interviewed for it, and I wasn't very kind because what I said was there's a competition between EU and China on green energy in Africa. Like seriously, there's one. So I'm happy that you found a research a case study that is about competition. But more seriously, though, I've been on something of a China bender since I was in Beijing last autumn, and I've been on a bit of a China bender since then, in part because I think anyone who experiences what China has managed to do for itself, right? Because I think that's the first place we should start. What it's managed to do for itself, what it's managed to do for its people, what it's managed to do for its sovereignty, because at the end of the day, the job of any state is to safeguard its sovereignty. What it's managed to do for all of that should be deeply impressed, and then should ask questions. What does this mean for the rest of the world? Because then you start asking the question of if China is definitely, one can understand why China is doing what it's doing. One can understand the drive to dominate, several steps of supply chains, but also advance into AI and advanced manufacturing. It's very easy to understand because, of course, it's still a developing country. We don't like putting it that way, but it still is a developing country. There are still people whose lives could be better developed in the country, and it's also hitting certain limits internally as well. So one can understand that, but it doesn't stop us from asking the question, what does all of this mean for the rest of us? What does it mean for Europe? What does it mean for African countries? Because I think sometimes we are not framing the question right. If we are starting by looking at the competition aspect of it, I think we're missing the point that certain things are not even, there's no competition on them anymore. It's been done. There is pretty much no solar cell manufacturing industry anywhere else in the world except in China or through China. So then so these are questions that I've been asking myself, and I'm then asking myself, so if that's the case, then what does the flying geese development model, so sort of the Asia thing where a country moves up the value chain in technology development and then leaves the early manufacturing stages, the textile, the glasses, the things, the basic stuff to other countries, because that's always been a development model that we've imagined, and African countries have imagined as well, that they would then be the place where lower value manufacturing happens. What does that mean for that? So I'm saying all of this to sort of frame the way that I think of the China and the rest of the world question. I don't see it just as China Africa or China Europe or even China US. That's the more interesting one, actually, because you actually can have a competition there. But what I'm seeing more is, what does the rise of China mean for us, and how do we engage with that rise in a way that works for us instead of a way that could explode in our faces? So that's just by way of introduction to how I'm thinking of the general topic here. But to engage more with the question that you raised, so I just finished writing an article. So the European Policy Center, EPC, they have, I think every 6 months, a compendium of European Chinese think tanks writing on specific topics. So this year I'm contributing to one as a European think tank on China, EU, Africa, and the green transition. And I've got to the point now where I'm beginning to say, let's get real about what is actually possible, but also for Europe. Because I think that's one area that of course, that's not the topic of the paper, but that's one thing that I find that I would actually like to read. Again, not topic of a paper, so I'm not saying you should have done it. That I would like to read, which is how does Europe engage with China in Europe? Which is the question that you raised earlier, Jennifer. So if Volkswagen is closing down factories in Germany and extending its R&D facility in China, what conversation should be happening now? Right? If BYD is considering taking over some Volkswagen plants that is being left here, what conversation should be happening now here? if there are concerns from Europe, and there should be concerns from Europe about possibility of export control, because China is also concerned about that from the other side. There should be concerns on all sides because they all use it. Okay, so if Europe is concerned about that, what is Europe trying to do about it? Actually do about it. Okay, so if Europe is concerned that there are possible security infrastructure vulnerabilities to imports that have Chinese produced, what is Europe going to do about it? And like really do about it? Because these are like really important questions to answer, and that would then include the third country, the third state angle, which you mentioned. And so that's the case that I'm making in the article, is there is probably a diplomatic arrangement that helps deal with some of these European vulnerabilities on supply chain security, on possibly export control issues, including security of the actual installations that might include certain things. There probably is a way to handle that by investing in production in third countries, right? But I almost cannot see that investment happening without China. I almost cannot see any value chain that includes critical minerals now, today, without China. So how do we structure that is what the question should be. I understand that the agenda in Brussels and in many European capitals, at least what they say, I don't know whether that's the real agenda, but what they say is that they want to create alternative supply chains. But how would that happen? What does that look like? What is the time horizon in which one does that, and who pays for it? So all I'm trying to say is, I'm agreeing with you, Jennifer, that Europe needs a really serious conversation with itself on its place in the world, aka in relation to the US, in relation to China, and in relation to African countries as well. Because I meant what I said in the morning, it's becoming really frustrating for many African stakeholders to deal with Europe, because I still got a message from someone in a Southern African country over the weekend, like, oh yeah, the Finns have said X, Y, Z. Are they going to do it? We don't know. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so a lot of reflection and strategizing work to do on the European side. Let me now turn to Xing, and before I do this, maybe also a reminder that afterwards we will open the floor, and there will be many empty chairs here, so maybe you can already start thinking about if you want to come in, if you have any questions or thought that you would like to add to the discussion. But now, Xing, maybe you haven't listened to the other two. What are your thoughts on the role of the EU and China in countries of the Global South? What were maybe also outcomes or examples of the study that you found surprising or that match your experience with your professional background in energy diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Martin, for that study, and for giving us also the opportunity to have the discussion here in Berlin. And in this context where everything is about strategic autonomy and about rivalry, it's good to be reminded also that the Europe and China have actually much more in common than we sometimes hear these days. I mean, both blocs are net importers of fossil fuels. Both blocs are major producers of zero-carbon technology. Europe still has a very strong offshore wind industry, for example. They therefore also have an interest in sustaining clean trade. And I think one thing that the question about whether Europe and China compete might not be the right one if you take it from the from the perspective of partner countries. And I think the question that you are asking in the study is, how can the third party take ownership of the projects and start developing their own industrial strategic plan. So I thought, because we've been hearing Macron going to Kenya, talking about China's predatory behavior, we've been hearing about, about that competition on the ground in terms of rhetoric. I thought I would bring some numbers that a partner of us collected about global attitudes toward clean tech made in China. Because I think it puts things also in perspective of what countries want. So it was an author called Berners-Lee that I think a lot of us are familiar with. They did a online survey of that attitude in 33 countries last year, and they found that solar panels and electric vehicles were quite appealing. To up to 87% in sub-Saharan Africa, across Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, 69% in Latin America, and 67% in the Middle East of people had a positive attitude to Chinese equipment. And so when we take that as a context when discussing the competition, I would also tend to agree with Olu, what Olu said, that some of those things are just not really negotiable anymore. It's really, you look at the situation in the country and what people want, and then you have to adapt to that. But that said, I mean, this high interest in cheap Chinese equipment is maybe not for the long run, because I think if countries start seeing a flooding of green tech from China, but don't see the manufacturing capacity and the jobs and the economic growth employments coming with that, then in the middle or the long term, you might see a reverse trend. So the numbers of Kenya's trade numbers were published last week, and they had a very big trade deficit with China. It dropped to 30%, also because their export numbers were dropped because of the macadamia crisis, etc. But what we're seeing is that they're importing quite a lot of intermediary products from China. So it's not really only just solar panels, but it's really machinery, intermediate products. So there's some value chain being created. And I think that's one thing that would be interesting to explore more, is what kind of trade and what kind of competition for what products? What products are we talking about? We're usually talking about wind farms and solar plants, but it's not always the final product that is being exported and exported. I think the conversation becomes much more interesting if you look at the components. Because the EU and China have a completely different, because then the picture looks different. The big offshore wind players are very, Chinese dominated, but if you look at the component level, then you have many more European players in the game. And so that gives you a different way also in framing the discussion. I think one thing that I agreed with your study, which I liked, was the project finance bit. About EU having, the tools of being able to de-risk projects, of the development finance institutions, its stakes in the multilateral development banks that can provide long-term financial stability, and that sort of addresses also a gap in Chinese export finance. The study was kind on Chinese development, on Chinese financiers. I think some of the gaps could have been, made more salient, and limited transparency around the terms of the collaterals, weaknesses in stakeholder engagement. That also raises the probability of the projects failing or projects being delayed. The fact that you mentioned the debt and the export credit and the lack of grant components, but also the fact that the Chinese investment is mainly with engineering companies. They don't take an equity stake in the project, so they usually come, build, and then they operate, but they don't really have a stake into the project on the longer term. So that can also affect the performance of the project. But yeah, I think that piece with some of the lacks of the Chinese model can be highlighted further so that European stakeholders can also profile their strengths, and also that partner countries receiving the funding and the projects can better shop if they know, which one is providing what. So I think it's, really liked the way that you framed the competition and the cooperation with the example. I think to conclude, one of the key things is which of the players will be able to provide the terms of financing and the projects that really leads to green industrial development. And if that's a combination from the two, with European banks and institutional actors providing the long-term financing, the de-risking, the project development that sort of also sets the standards, the environment and social safeguards, and Chinese providing the cheap equipment. But then that's also a feasibility issue for the EU, because that would not fly at the moment with the way that the NZIA and the Global Industrial Act is framed at the moment. So the political feasibility of such a partnership model, I think, is a question to the rest of the room.
Well, yeah, maybe we can applause. Thank you all for these very insightful remarks, and I think they will help also inform what happens further with the study. We will now proceed to the open fishbowl discussion. So I would ask you to make a little bit space here in the inner circle. This is not that you withdraw, right? You are invited to come in again at any time. And I will keep Martin so that you also get the chance to respond to some of the comments. But now I would ask everyone here in the room, come take a seat, engage in the discussion. I think we heard a lot. Okay, great. I have some questions in mind that some of the discussions brought up, but maybe you directly want to start. You were listening now so patiently for quite some time. So why don't you start, maybe introduce yourself briefly, and yeah.
Hi. I am Laura Figon. I'm from Mexico, and I have worked in impact investment and development finance, so I was very happy to hear a lot about the gap and all that. But my question is because the focus is more oriented like Europe, Germany, China, but you're also talking about the Global South, and the Global South is not sometimes involved in this conversation. So my question is how this race to zero emissions and all that, how can we avoid that it keeps deepening the inequalities that already exist? Because as a practitioner in the sector, sometimes I am frustrated about we are still working around the same system, and we think okay, we are investing in something that it's good or it's going to help the community and all that, and it continues to widen the same inequalities. So that's something I was thinking while I was hearing, and I would like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And also, I'm extending the invitation if somebody from the room would like to respond to any of the questions or thoughts that are brought up here, please do so, because I know there are also many experts in this room, and it doesn't only have to be the speakers. But now, Nora, you also wanted to come in, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Nora Sausmikat from Urgewald, and I have 2 remarks. And I would like to directly continue on the remarks of Xing. I don't know, where is she? Asking the question on MDBs, the role of MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and where's the finance going? And again, I highlighted that yesterday. We at Urgewald, we have a small team dealing with MDBs, mainly with World Bank, ADB, and AIIB. And these banks are owned by countries. And what we see just now, I mean, we heard from Martin and the study and the remarks here, money is needed for the transition. And what's going on right now is that the climate change action plan of the World Bank will stop probably this year. So the whole development is going back. No wonder. I mean, US is a main power in the World Bank, but also in the other banks and ADB. ADB is more or less steered by US and Japan, and AIIB by China. All these banks do not have, well, they have, first of all, the development towards gas and LNG and not renewables, plus nuclear, I mentioned that yesterday, plus a race to the button when it comes to safeguards. And we just talked about that right now. So it's up to the European shareholders, and especially to Germany, which is position number 4 in most of these banks, to put in their weight and push for the right transition, not the wrong transition, and not the wrong investments and wrong solutions. And there are so many wrong solutions. And yes, that's my first remark, because coming to the study, you said, what can Europe offer? Europe can offer strong regulations, or has a regulatory power and market. And this is, I think we should focus on not only in the MDBs, but also when it comes to investment. And lastly, I would like to highlight some numbers which are probably not well known, but as Urgewald is really focusing on number crunching on the fossils, I think I just would like to highlight 2 numbers which are important to know. So in the post-Paris period from 2015 to 24, 92% of the $470 billion going to the coal is coming from 7 countries, and there China is way on the top next to US and Japan. In the oil and gas sector in 2025, 96% of this industry is still expanding, and the top expander is China National Petroleum Corporation, the CNPC. So there is a rush still going on to new reserves, to the fossils, and I think it's too naive. It's nice to talk about this revolution and tech transition and so on, but we also have to see this other side, also the global LNG boom. So the finance industry is a hook, and nothing of all this can be done without finances. So that's my last word, and I think this is really up to Europe to put much more efforts into this direction, not only in MDBs, but also on private investors, asset managers, banks, which are all play a very major role in this expansion in the fossil industry.
Thank you, Nora. Martin, maybe it's your time to respond to some of the comments to the study.
Yeah, happily. But I also want to say that the points made in this round by Laura, by Nora, they also go to the room, right? So if you want to respond, if you want to chime in on that, feel free to join. There's more seats empty around this circle. Maybe I'll start with the 2 of you because it's fresher in my mind. I have to go back to my notes. But thanks for your comments, Jennifer, Olu, and Ting. I think, so finance is the key, it's true, but there's different natures of finance, right? And we're talking about ODA, we're talking about public funding, we're talking about budgets of nation states that are being constricted and where cuts are being leveled. And Nora, you pointed out that there's a lot of private finance happily going towards fossils, right? I think that's really a major issue that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, because these clean solutions to generate and use electricity are so overwhelmingly economical now, I think private finance will also follow just for that fact. It's not that they're going to divest. I'm sure that's not going to be the case, but also to help this movement towards electrification, electrotech, we have to use these levers and these small key inputs of finance that can really have a ripple effect and transform existing systems or get developments off the ground to create systems that then provide clean electricity. And that maybe comes to your point, Laura, where you're asking about inequalities. I think it's not only about electricity access, it's also about an ample supply of clean electricity that then allows commercial and economic activity. For example, like we also mentioned, value-added steps in assembly and in creating of or processing of raw materials that then end up in higher value goods that also can be exported. I think there is really one of the main entry points for the EU to enter into partnerships to get these, to bankroll these kinds of investments that then can really snowball into something bigger. And in our study, we have this example where, for example, in Kenya, a startup is producing or wants to deploy EV buses for public transport. And this is in line with Kenyan national climate policy and how they want to decarbonize the transport sector, but also the economy in total. And of course, the components are coming from China, but they also want to establish a supply chain and localize assembly and maybe later also more of the higher value addition steps in the supply chain in Kenya. And some of the inputs there are also being provided from the European side. Finance, technological know-how, but there's also opportunities to really to be a key actor at the table in these kinds of developments. We also talked about this in our case study where I think it was MIT alumni who were working for the startup in Kenya. They wanted to travel to Europe to visit, interestingly, a BYD factory to learn more about EV manufacturing batteries. But the German embassy and the people in power to make this happen were not ready to allow them entrance to Europe, to the Schengen area, to make the trip to Europe. And thus, the opportunity was missed for Europe, for Germany to be part of this development of this project, to really play, like this kind of plays into the argument that there's diplomatic assets also on the European side that they can use to really shine and portray themselves and also realistically fill the role of a benevolent actor that wants to help these developments. The roles of MDBs, you mentioned Nora. I think it's interesting that we have a European investment bank that's really under the guise of the European Commission and the member states. And it is going to be endowed with a lot less money in the next multi-annual financial framework if we don't put a shift to this tendency in how the negotiations are going. And one of the things that are going to be cut quite substantially is the Global Europe instrument, under which, interestingly, financial tools like de-risking fall, so guarantees leveled by the EU and its lending arm, the EIB. And if this comes to pass, if these cuts come to pass, well, the ideas of de-risking, of bankrolling, of providing key, minuscule almost, but essential inputs to bankroll and get electrification projects off the ground will just not be around anymore. And we want more of those, yeah? So in our research for this paper, we talked to people in the European Chambers of Commerce, right? And they are complaining that they're the European incumbent firms that want to go abroad and want guarantees and securitization or insurance of their investments abroad they are asking for more. They're not getting this enough. And it's these companies, if they don't get it, why should we see it in these kinds of examples where we say it's not much that's needed for a few dozen or even hundreds of public housing to have solar panels on the rooftop in remote areas of the Philippines? And interestingly, the national export credit agencies and insurers, guarantee providers like Euler Hermes and the like, they are using these services as a money-making opportunity, right? They're asking fees, which are quite substantial, and they higher the security ranking of the country that is the destination of the investment is. And across Africa, most countries are ranked 6 or 7 on the security scale in a negative sense. So if you're ranked 1 or 2, it's going to be cheaper. This explains the gap in capital costs, right, that we see from poorer countries to richer countries. And if the national guarantee providers and export credit providers are not even in it in a concessional way, then where does the money come from if we're at the same time cutting ODA and endowing the EIB with less money to do exactly that? So I think there's really potential for a huge opportunity missed if the EU goes on to really use the chainsaw to cut down ODA and do away with this asset that it really is known for and that really can use to wield and to exert a lot of influence for the better. Even if we talk about efficiency, if we talk about smaller overall sums, I think a lot can be had from substantial means that the EU can provide, even if it's mixed in some way with private finance. But I think the concessional part, the concessionality, is a key thing. And if that goes away, the EU really is losing one of its core things that it brings to the table. The MFF is under negotiation at this moment, right? The negotiations are going on in Brussels at the moment, and it's going to be concluded by the end of this year.
So we heard now a lot on the financial side of things, development finance, cost of capital, debt you talked about. But there were also some other questions raised by some of the discussants who might be interested to come in again, but maybe also some here in the room, which I think value a closer look. I mean, Martin, you mentioned just now that one of the key roles of the EU comparatively still to China is the concessional finance that it provides. Also, it's shrinking, as we all know. But when we asked before the Mentimeter question here to the audience of who plays the biggest role in countries, the EU was rated least. And I'm just wondering, I don't know what made you choose the EU lastly, but whether some of the elements that you mentioned, why you think the EU can still have a significant role and what could be strength also in comparison to China, make some of the people here, made them change their mind or at least increased a little bit the way you were thinking about this before. So yeah, just raising this question a little bit to everyone here in the room. I know it's already a little bit late in the afternoon, everyone is getting tired, but it would be great to hear 1 or 2 more voices.
I have another, maybe while people are making up their minds if they want to join the circle. There's one. Hi. I'm not surprised that the survey showed these results, because if we ask about the energy transition, the first thing that the mind goes to is the intangibles, right? The tangibles, the components, the megawatts, the gigawatts, and the numbers. And we had a lot of talk about what huge outsized role China played in this development in the recent years, and also today and yesterday. So I think that is quite warranted. If the question were different, for example, asking about the role in sustainable development, not focusing on the energy sector, it might be different.
My name is Martin Medelanis. I'm an economist at the Freie University here in Berlin. About your question, why the EU was ranked least, I think I had a lot, it was tough to choose between the regional countries and China. In the end, I chose for China because right now what we've seen in Pakistan, but also in other places like Brazil, is that China just pushes in or brings forward the energy transition, not necessarily with governmental cooperation, but by selling its products. And I think this is a really different approach than the European countries have right now at the moment. And another interest, most European countries are focused on the question, where do we get the raw materials, where do we get cheap energy? While China also wants the raw materials, they also have an interest in selling their products, which already exist, and to see the countries as a market. No, and I think this choice as, okay, we want to sell our products to different countries and make money by selling solar panels or selling EVs is a different role where you also need less government cooperation, and you can just doing it via a market channel. At the same time, I think the European Union simply does not have so much to offer for many countries. I think they played a bigger role in the whole hydrogen uptake of green hydrogen, but as now the Europeans lost interest or found out that it's simply too expensive and nearly no one's talking about green hydrogen anymore, projects, let's say there's not a big uptake of projects, it's rather stagnating. And this was a way where the European Union perhaps was among the leading destinations, while in raw materials, simply China's already there, the US is already there, and Europe tries to enter new markets, but they don't offer more. No, they don't say, okay, when you sell your copper to us, we will do smeltering here in the place. They simply kind of have the same strategy without providing a new opportunity, and this makes it hard to enter already existing markets. And I think this is also why Europe is perhaps placed in the last spot. And perhaps one thing with regard to this, also what the countries offer. Brazil now has serious talks about rare earth, also, let's say, at least partly linked to the energy transition. And they said, okay, we only sell them if we got a local content, local content addition in our country. And in the end, they made deals with the United States where you would guess, okay, this is perhaps the most unreliable partner now. But somehow when they entered and they said, okay, we follow your requirements, and actually it's something that is better for Brazil now, at least in some sense, because they have local value creation that they did not have in Chinese in sales to China. So I think this should be more the way to orient towards, okay, what do the countries really require from us, instead of going, okay, we don't have so much more to offer.
Maybe just quickly commenting on this before I pass on to the other two. I mean, I think what's interesting here is what we haven't talked about yet is that China also has different strategies, right? I mean, there was this Belt and Road Initiative, which is still in place and which apparently is, again, increasing in terms of finance that they mobilize and mega projects that they fund. But then they also have this Small but Beautiful Projects initiative, where it's more about financing small-scale projects that is mainly driven by commercial actors from China, and which doesn't have necessarily that state-driven model which the Belt and Road Initiative has. And I think this then leads also to some of maybe the more negative consequences, where I do think that the EU could play a stronger role, which is that, as Martin, you showed in your presentation, the funding of Chinese companies or even by the government is mostly in countries that already have market access, that are a little bit better off than some of the low-income in countries, where you need more support, be it in form of financial guarantees or low-cost finance, to kickstart the first investments, because they are not profitable yet. And I think this is where at the moment China is not really being present, and where they do not invest as much as it would be needed. So yeah, I would say maybe there's a role that the EU could take up on more by strategically looking at where is China already present, where can we play a role, where can we come with our also technical political expertise that we can bring in, respecting the context of the countries, by then maybe supporting them to a way where in the end they might be able to have some manufacturing themselves and then be more independent in the future. But as this is not the case in the beginning, I think it makes sense for the EU maybe to close a little bit this gap that we find there. And I think, and this is also a little bit to the topic that you mentioned before, which is the inequality topic, because I mean, we also saw this in the context of Pakistan, right, where China or Chinese companies exported a lot of like solar panels, which benefited many people in Pakistan, but mostly middle income households that could absorb the, even if it's low cost, but low cost prices for buying the PV panels. So the question is still a bit, how can we make sure that we get this to the broader population, and how can this also go hand in hand within the grid modernization, which could also be a role for the EU, for example, which I think you also elaborated on in your paper. But now a lot that I brought in, and maybe just a reminder also for the online audience that they can submit questions and Fabiola will bring them in. But now we have 3 new faces here, yeah? Very short, and then we go.
Yeah, totally. I see your point that the EU could jump in there and there's a gap, but do you see a real interest currently in European politics to do so? Because I think now, at least from Germany, the interest is a lot, okay, what can we get from it now? And also in the last projects that were done, it was about this. And to say, okay, we could provide financing in immature markets, or let's say small countries with high uncertainty, does not fit very well into this new paradigm of European policy. So I wonder, where exactly do you see Europe there doing what you proposed?
I won't respond now to this, but Kerstin, you were nodding, so maybe you want to come in.
Yeah, I can not. I try to respond. My question or my remark is.
You can just quickly introduce yourself.
Sorry. Yes. Hi, Kerstin Opfer from Germanwatch. My remark is a bit along your lines of identifying where the EU can actually, well, in line with their plans and strategies, still contribute or, well, compete, question mark. Still agree with Olu, though, that this is really hard. What we have so far not really discussed is recycling and reusing of RE technology. And this is a question because I really don't know, but I think there is a huge opportunity for developing strategies with partner countries on how they can reuse the massive amounts of cheap Chinese technology that is flooding into their countries and will continue to flood into their countries over the next years, right? And they have an end life. For example, the company that Martin mentioned just before, the Kenyan startup, is using the batteries that they use for their buses, they can use until the capacity reaches 80%. This is still a large amount of capacity for a battery that can support a bus, right? And they are starting to explore ideas of reusing or refurbishing the battery in a way that they can reuse them in mini-grids. And I think this is really an interesting area to explore more, and also exploring where the EU can actually support these types of efforts of partner countries, of startups. No idea if China is already active there, but I think it's, in most debates that I'm observing, a bit underexplored, this idea of reusing and recycling. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ifra. I wanted to make a quick interjection on Pakistan's solar boom specifically. Like, we have been talking about inequality, but what has been missing in this conversation is that this was very bottoms up and also led by people in rural areas where the grid has not been able to reach. And this is why I wanted to ask more about the Philippines case study, because I found interesting parallels there. Solar has the potential to really, transform lives of people who are on the periphery, who are on the margins. And in the case of Pakistan, what we saw is that people who for decades really did not have that access were, just by bringing up whatever resources they had, invest in this technology. And the EU, it's interesting because it has a very complementary the relationship between EU and China and a country like Pakistan is very complementary there because it has been also financing a lot of renewable green transition projects. And then you have like a lot of imports of cheap solar from China. So it can work together. I think the key is also that these ODA projects do not like get discontinued. Perhaps we also try to have more partnerships developed with civil society actors, with startups, with local actors. And yeah, I wanted to ask more about perhaps the case of Philippines, and I'm pretty sure there's more cases like this because it's not just all middle income and not middle income, but like specifically upper income groups which are leading this. It's also people who are on the periphery, and for them, this is transformative.
Marty, maybe you want to respond directly to the question about the Philippines, and then we pass on to Laura.
Yeah, happy to. I think it's very illuminating, this case of Pakistan. So when you say the rural areas were also beneficiaries of the solar PV imports, that's just speaking to the point of how affordable it is. It's just amazing how affordable and available this technology is by now. And what still, I think, stands as one of the conclusions that one has to draw from the Pakistani case is that it was mostly adopted by a group of people, a share of the population that was able to afford it because they were solvent enough. And I think what also, you mentioned this, Sarah, and I tried to hint at it in my presentation, it's not enough to have a bit of supply that really benefits the household that puts it on its rooftop. It also we need a grid, especially in larger countries like Pakistan is one, with a huge population. You have to have a power grid that is flexible to increase the uptake of renewables, that also allows economic activity, industrial activity, and this cannot be done by cheap PV imports that land on the rooftops in disparate ways. As good as it is for these beneficiaries who were able to afford it, then it needs more. And the other things that need to happen for I think it's a transition, right? We need to talk about transition in Pakistan because there's a lot of coal power. Those are huge, huge challenges, and they cannot be tackled by the remaining constituents who are reliant on the grid. The Pakistani state has a huge challenge cut out for itself if it wants to decarbonize. And there, Europe and European actors have a role to play by providing financial inputs, by providing advice in terms of designing the transition, power market reform, reforming the incentives around power production, but also consumption, supply and demand side. There's really a lot to be done, and I think the Europeans can really shine because of, like I mentioned, there's a lot of experience also on the European side. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. I have another point about inequalities and stuff where ODA-like and concessionality things come into play, but I think you wanted to also make another remark. So let me hand it over to you first.
Thank you. Now I have like a lot of notes because my question is going back to your question about why Europe ranked the least. And I came back because it relates to my previous comment. I vote for regional actors. And yeah, I think like because, I believe like now we have maybe with all these changes that are happening like geopolitically, we feel that we have some kind of also power, and we want to be in the conversation and in the negotiations as partners, not as you say, other strategies as clients or where like to extract from. So I think that's what I vote, and I think also many countries probably are seeing this opportunity and this, they will like to take that role of partners. And for example, I also, there was recently, like 2 years ago or something, 1 year ago, there was a report by the United Nations that said remittances are now higher than ODA. And there is, for example, another opportunity for this cooperation, this partnership. Like we are a lot of migrants in the global north that come from the global south, and we still want to like connect and support our countries. And this is also, I believe, like another area of opportunity where we can like think different and do something different. And just like a general comment, like if the perception for China's products is shifting like so to a positive way, I also believe like maybe like reinforcing or calling like, okay, these countries, they are getting cheap technology. It's also not so helpful because, I mean, maybe it's what we can afford and it's what is helping us. And we would like to have some like knowledge transfer and like this gap that can be filled, I guess, by the European Union. But I also think like the discourse has maybe to be different, like to reach this level of partnership and reduce these inequalities. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Because you just mentioned remittances, I think that struck me because this has to do with revenue, right? It has to do with income. And the idea of the solar PV on public housing and local government units organizing this in the Philippines it comes down to this point that it's not so remote that you don't have grid access, but it's remote enough that it's not very developed. The electricity that's needed is provided with diesel generators. They can be wholly exchanged at low cost, and because grid connection is available, then the solar and battery combination can generate revenue for this little constituency, this little village, that then can it can earn the payment back in a few years' time, and then the de-risking and the little bit of finance input that was needed in the end to make this happen at all is actually going to be going to be made good on. It's just a no-brainer actually, and the Chinese firms who are producing these inputs so cheaply, they are not channeling it towards these kind of destinations because they're far away from their commerce centers, right? So it's no wonder that Europe and Asia are the markets of these goods because they are developed, they're accessible, there's established logistic routes, there's population density, yeah? Solar and other renewable appliances are just a lot more efficient if you bring them to highly packed population centers. It's just basic economics. And to make these, I think I called it the tipping point of the electrotech revolution, right? We have to make an effort to make this revolution reach far and wide, because it's not at the moment. It's not. And it won't if we don't make this happen. And I think there's so much to win.
Okay, I think it would be great to do a last round, maybe also with our speakers here, who have patiently listened to all the questions and are now in a well-positioned situation to answer. No, but maybe I can ask you to join us for a few last comments.
And I can bridge the time they need until they're sat in the circle again.
I still have some questions that I want to raise, but you get the chance to still have a few thoughts. So I think some of the questions that were asked that maybe some of you want to respond to, you don't have to, but was the question that Kerstin brought up about recycling, reproducing clean tech, if that's maybe an opportunity also for startups that the EU should support in countries. Then there was the question that you asked, Martin, about is there really a motivation by the EU to go into countries where currently there's no real market access, where cost of capital are high, where the investments are not necessarily productive at the moment. So this is something that you might want to elaborate on. Then something that Yuxing mentioned in the beginning, and I think that came up also again, is the question of So if now China exports so much of its clean tech to many of the emerging and developing economies, what's about the agency of the countries themselves to then, I mean, I think this is the ideal scenario that we are talking about, that they also build up capacity to be able to do at least some of the manufacturing in the countries themselves in the future. So I think here it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about how this could happen and what will be needed, and also how can countries be supported that maybe are not in a very strong negotiation position. Because I mean, we talked in the morning a lot about Brazil, and Brazil is in a very good negotiation position because it's a strong and big country. But what about smaller countries, also many African countries? How can they be supported in negotiating good deals that really add local value addition in the future? And then maybe a last question. Yeah, this was what Olo brought up, and maybe also some of you want to give this a try to answer, is a little bit, if we assume that certain developments that we are seeing can't be changed anymore, that China will remain a dominant clean tech superpower in many industries, and the EU shouldn't compete in all of those areas with China anymore, or limit it to some of the industries where it can keep a competitive advantage. The question then is a little bit under what conditions is industrial cooperation for the EU still beneficial with other countries? So in what way could this be structured? That some parts of the industry and of the industrial value chain maybe move to some of those countries. Not everything has to happen here in Europe, and there are also like several good reasons why it might make sense to move some of the value chain to those countries because it's cheaper to produce there, etc. But under what conditions should this be structured? So this is a lot of food of thought, and I'm not sure if you want to still come in with something else or respond to some of the comments. Okay, then maybe you can start, and then we just do a round.
Hello. I'm Christoph. First of all, I'm not an academic, but I have a perspective on the local startups, agency of the countries, especially for small countries, because in the last 3 years I've been living between Berlin and Kigali in Rwanda, and the topic hasn't come up yet, but electric mobility has been a big development there. So the main mean of transport is a motorcycle, which was like the taxi. And when I first came there 3 years ago, about 90% of the motor taxis were still fossil fueled, about 10% were electric. And nowadays in the city in Kigali, around every second taxi is electric. And the biggest suppliers are actually local companies. So there's one called Ampersand, it's a Rwandan company, and the other is Spyro, which I think is also from an African country. I don't know from which, maybe from Kenya, I don't know. But they don't import the bikes. They are all manufactured locally. I presume mostly with Chinese suppliers, not with European ones, because Europe is usually the more expensive one. So that's already a thing that exists. Like, people have their own agency, the countries have their own agency. There are startups, especially with sustainable things, using Chinese resources more than European ones. And in the other kinds of electric mobility, you also see more Chinese products than European ones. So Kigali got an electric bus network. It was stamped out of the ground within 1 year. And now most of the buses you see in the city are electric, and they are imported from China. I don't know if it was Hertie or another company. Yeah, so, and European products are usually not very visible because they're always upmarket. So the people who trade with Europe from there, it's usually just the top 1%, the upper class, which can afford to spend money on status. Everyone who just needs a product that's worked and affordable, they get it from China. That's how the world works at the moment. So I don't really know what Europe actually has to offer in that regard.
Well, thank you for sharing this perspective on the ground. I think it's very useful, and I think it also touches on one of the little case studies that you did in the study. So maybe later you can also complement a little bit this. But thank you. Let's move now on. Maybe Xing, we start with you this time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to everyone who stepped in and participated to the conversation. It was really interesting. On the sort of industrial, sort of how to have green industrialization when you're being flooded with Chinese products, I think we need a nuanced discussion on that. So basically, the case that I was mentioning about Kenya's trade deficit with China, which has grown in the last quarter, was interesting because when you look at what the products are that Kenya is importing from China, it's not like PV panels or products that are already done. They're importing a lot of machinery, intermediate products, and that is actually a good sign because it's a sign that the country is adding value and that it's producing, equipment that they can potentially sell or trade across the continent or use themselves. And I think the study that I would like to see, but I don't know if any one of you here is looking into it, is where are the different countries in that industrial value chain? So which are the countries that are already just strategically choosing the components to build an industry? And which are the countries that are literally being flooded with the products? Because I think those different cases call for different type of financing, different type of support, and without that sort of data analysis, it's difficult to intervene in a way that would provide real agency. One case that I thought was interesting was, which was in the press last week, was this case of the Ethiopian solar companies. There were 2 Ethiopian solar companies that got sued in the US for exporting PV panels to the US. So basically, there was 8 US solar manufacturers who sued those 2 Ethiopian companies because the products were 60% Chinese components. And so they sued them for sort of circumventing the anti-dumping regulation. But then you have to look at the case. Is Ethiopia actually also adding value with those companies, creating jobs and creating employment? How much are those Chinese equipments used by Ethiopian companies building in terms of industrial power in Ethiopia? Because that's another trade barrier that is interesting to look at. Because if some of the anti-dumping rules are really sort of squeezing Ethiopian companies or other companies in the global south from building their own industry, that's also something to look at. And it's not just Ethiopia. So a lot of countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, are also under investigation under that anti-dumping rule. And some of this is probably just sheer tariff circumvention by Chinese companies, but some of it might also add value. Yeah. So which one is it? We need more research. We need more analysis. Yeah.
Well, thank you for differentiating also a little bit, because we were discussing different recommendations how to engage, but of course, in the end, it depends always on the country's context and what they specifically need, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I think that became clear out of the discussion. But now let me move to you, Olu. What do you still want to add to the discussion? Not only negative things.
I thought I was very positive. I was saying we should do this so that we don't end up having a problem. That was positive, it was constructive. No, but more seriously, I think we need to understand a bit more what is actually possible in Africa. And I want to build on what you've said, because I don't think we know that. A whole lot of articles that I read on Africa, and I guilty of this same thing starts with Africa has 30% of global. And we don't even know whether this is true because I think it's released from some S&P number from somewhere, because that's where companies report what they found. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's available on the continent. Starting from the minerals that African countries have, we don't know it. We also don't know the answer to the question we should pose, which is how many of these countries are actually able to manufacture things now and are already importing things that can be used for manufacturing things now. Because one of the things that we're seeing from Chinese exports, not just to Africa, is an increase in machinery going outside of China. So that means that it's for productive use in those countries, not just consumables, right? So we have not seen that. How many countries are actually ready to be a manufacturing destination, even if the EU were to consider partnerships in African countries to build things that the EU needs? What collection of countries could produce what products? We also don't know that, because having minerals is just one thing. You need other stuff as well. What's the logistics mixed there, and so on and so forth. So all I'm saying is leading to one thing. What are the industrial policies that African countries have? Do they have them? Could they have them? Who can pay for them to have them, right? Because we know that for a very long time, this industrial policy was a thing that we never spoke about in development. I used to work at the development bank, so we never spoke about industrial policy because it was, someone put it a certain way, that you don't give crack to an addict, because that's what industrial policy is for poor country governments. It's just a way for them to share money. I mean, literally, someone said that, okay, in a major development bank. So, but we're at the point now where if we're starting to agree that the only way for countries to actually deliver prosperity at scale is by industrializing, right? That's the only way anybody has ever done it. So Africans are not going to be the first who do it any other way. But we're also asking Africans to do it a different way. We're asking Africa to industrialize in a different way, by not burning fossil fuels, because again, that's how everybody has done it. That's how China is still doing it, right? So if that's going to be the case in Africa, then are we going to support them to develop these industrial policies that actually make sense and tie them to what are the vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier about Europe, depending on China for so much of the inputs that you don't do that even with your closest friend. You did it with US. That's why we are partly where we are right now. So even with your closest friends, you don't depend on them that much, right? So maybe you shouldn't depend on one source for that much. And if you can't create new supply chains now, maybe corporations in third countries could be a midterm way for you to get to where you want to get to, and then you can keep working on, I don't know, the alternate supply chains by the side. It's a long-term project. So this is what I'm saying. We should map out as much as possible what is possible in Africa. We should support African governments to have industrial policies that make sense, right? Because you need those minerals, but you also need energy nodes on the continent that can support those industrial activities, and then map that to what Europe needs. Like, Europe doesn't need minerals. Europe doesn't, if Europe gets minerals now, they don't know what to do with it. No, there's no refining happening here anymore. What Europe needs is industrial inputs that have minerals in them. What are those industrial inputs? Can we map them to what Africa can do? And can we have a conversation? And I know that it's difficult to do at the diplomatic level. I know your job has been really hard. I know that's difficult to do. But I think we have to try, for the sake of all of us, for the sake of Europe, for the sake of African countries, and in some level for the sake of China as well, because countries are going to push back. And they will break things when they push back. Countries will not accept what is called dumping. I used to work on trade, so I don't like the word dumping, but countries will not accept that after a while. And they're beginning not to accept that now. So for the sake of everyone, let's all sit down and have a conversation of adults and say, this is what we should do now, and let's do it.
That was very positive ending. Very well done. Well, no, last but not least, Jennifer. And then maybe for very quick remarks, Martin, but in light of the time, maybe you can keep both interventions short. Thank you.
I can build on this exchange, which I thought was super interesting and important. I agree it needs to be a nuanced conversation, and I think, I just started to tell Ola, I was at a dinner last week in Beijing with African ambassadors about this topic. And what I found, it was fascinating, there was a generational difference as well. So the younger ambassadors basically were saying to me, this is more bilaterally after the dinner, yes, we don't want just the dumping of cheap stuff. We want to make whatever it is, the panels, the second generation panels, whatever it might be, but we're not ready. It was how to, and also to have the capacity to negotiate with China is also really, and understand how China ticks, because it's different. They've had to deal with the West for a long time. So I think, having a really differentiated kind of a conversation where we do the type of exercise that you mentioned is quite important. I think the question about, is Europe really interested in this? I think it gets, if you have, and this is why you need a joined up European perspective, the Foreign Office, involved in the geopolitical side of things, along with the folk in the economics ministry who are looking at de-risking and the need to de-risk and looking at new partners and the new partners in the geopolitical side of things. And then you actually have an eye-level self-interest conversation. I actually found the question asked in the plenary a false question, because it was like, do you do self-interest or do you do cooperation? You have to have self-interest. There's no room anymore just for, I wish there was, but that doesn't mean that it has to be transactional, because there is a landing ground. There are sweet spots where you can find the self-interest of each party and then build the coalition or the various actors to come in. And I think finding some models is really important. I met last week with BYD, and and this gets to the different pieces. Like BYD in Brazil, well, Lula negotiated a great deal, right? That gets to this capability thing again, and that's evidently like the model that's out there. But then if you look at where other places where that's happening, it's not necessarily. So where are the kind of lighthouse projects that we can then use and then build around to create more of those? I just two last points on finance, Nora. It's not only the German ED at the World Bank, it's all of the Europeans. Like, there's such a lack of a European finance development collaboration. It's a piece of the puzzle that I just think is so fundamental, because otherwise, and they don't coordinate from all, we tried, but, everybody has their own interests. It's the same as like every member state going to China to sell their goods. So how to have more collaboration in order to have a bigger say and use the agency that European Commission and member states have together. I'm sure you're doing that, but I just kind of, Germany is important, but if we don't get it to work with the others, then we're not going to get there. And recycling, I don't want to forget the recycling question. I think it came up last week as well, and I do see battery recycling. If you're looking for areas where Germany and China could work, or Europe and China could work together, I think there is a possibility there, but Europe has to create the capacity to the industries here to do the recycling. Otherwise, they'll all go to China, and we'll have the same problem all over again. So it may not be a joint China-EU thing. It may be a EU business model thing where you take out the minerals and from the batteries and you recycle them and you create a whole new way of doing things, which would be in a circular economy where Europe has a bit of an advantage still, I think. And then once that's built, then maybe there can be some more collaboration. But otherwise, I think they'll eat the European lunch again. And then it won't help. But I do see opportunities there. I think it's a really interesting example that you brought up.
Well, thank you so much for really responding to so many questions that were still out there. So I think by now we should almost have responded to all the comments and questions. So thank you so much for everyone who engaged in the discussion. I think we will now proceed to the break. That's well deserved. So thank you everyone who contributed, and the conference is going on in, I think, 4:30. So half an hour, and I would really encourage everyone to also still stay for the last panel, where we will have Jennifer and Adriana. It's your third time speaking here. Adriana. For a great conversation on gender, war, climate issues. So only the small topics. And well, thank you everyone.